Hi, and welcome to 5-Minute Fridays. So with AP Government this year, we're going to try to do 5-Minute Fridays covering all of our major vocabulary that we've done for the week. So I've combined the first 2 weeks. So last week was the first week of school, and so this week we're going to be talking about democracy and the Constitution. So when we think about American democracy, there are 5 principles of American democracy. That would include consent of the governed, limited government, rule of law, representative democracy, and just the idea of democracy in general. So when we think about consent of the governed, it's that idea that we have these rights. John Locke talked about these natural rights, and it's the government's responsibility to protect those rights. We give up our power in order for them to protect us. That's our consent. We've given that. We are the governed. Ultimately, that ties into democracy, because democracy is ruled by the people. As President Lincoln said in the Gettysburg Address, of the people, for the people, by the people. We are the ones who are ruling. But there's no way that we can all physically go to D.C., so we can't have that direct democracy. Instead, we have representative democracy. And we expect that our government is under the rule of law, that it applies to everyone equally. Additionally, we believe firmly in separation of powers and that the idea that government has specific roles. So when we think about our government, James Madison was very fearful that we were going to have just too many factions, and property, we thought, was kind of the unequal distribution of property was the biggest issue. Today, interest groups are kind of the modern day version of factions, but he thought that a large republic would solve that problem. So ultimately what we see is the idea of, which finds itself in pluralist theory, the idea that all of those different groups would kind of work together and compromise. Unfortunately, in reality, we really more have a hyper-pluralist system where we have all these competing ideas and there's not as much compromise. That's probably what most people kind of see as the reality what's happening in our country today. There are also people who believe in elite theory, which is the idea that a wealthy 1 to 2% of our population, the extreme wealthy, are kind of controlling everything and they're making all the decisions. Ultimately, though, we do design a government that we had the Articles of Confederation first, this League of Friendship that really was just too weak, putting too much power in the hands of the local state governments, and ultimately they didn't have the power to tax, they couldn't move an army, and so it was just too weak. So at the Constitutional Convention, kind of the thing you need to remember is compromise, and we're just going to see compromises that are happening. The Constitution is based on the Madisonian model, which sets up these 3 kind of separate branches of government and the idea that power is going to be shared between them. But also we don't want to give the people too much power. They definitely kind of feared the uneducated public. And we're going to see that the House is the only branch of government, or the only part of government, that is actually directly elected by the people. The Senate is chosen by the state legislatures, and even the President is chosen through the Electoral College. But compromise is kind of the word of the day, and eventually they will compromise, and the big compromise is the Connecticut Compromise done by kind of most important man in the room, because Roger Sherman is the man who saves the day. These guys were willing to go home until the Great Compromise happens. So with the Great Compromise, we end up with our bicameral legislature, with the House being the lower house based on population, and the upper house being the Senate, with each state getting equal representation. So trying to make both the small states happy with this compromise. And then ultimately they're going to set up this Constitution that's going to have our preamble, and then we're going to have what set out our goals and ideas of the Constitution, and then we're going to have our 7 articles, which kind of gives our structure. And then in order to pass the Constitution, to get it ratified, the Bill of Rights are going to be added, and this is a concession to the Anti-Federalists. So kind of our key terms here when thinking about our articles, I gave you a little acronym to help you remember. Lucy eats Jolly Ranchers and cooks rats. So that's going to be our legislative, executive, judicial, relationship between the states, amending the Constitution is supreme, and finally ratification. And so those articles are key to kind of understanding the essence of our government and how it works. And that's going to lead us to federalism, because that's the system that they set up, a federalist system with the national government being supreme, that federal central government kind of controlling everything, but shared power with the state governments. And that's going to be our focus next week when we get into federalism. That's the next chapter in our book. And so I'll see you back next week for episode 2 of our 5-Minute Fridays when we focus on federalism. Have a great weekend.